In 2019, President Donald Trump's offhand remark about purchasing Greenland seemed more like a fleeting eccentricity than a serious political maneuver. But fast forward to today, and Europeans are waking up to a stark reality. Trump's ambition to take control of Greenland is no longer a distant possibility. It's becoming a pressing existential challenge to the very foundation of the NATO alliance. Imagine the United States, the most powerful member of NATO, not merely influencing but claiming sovereignty over an island that is strategically vital, yet part of another NATO country. How would this affect the credibility of NATO's defense pact, a promise to defend each other at all costs? How would Europe respond when the very concept of sovereignty is at risk? This isn't just a battle for land, it's a battle for the future of international law, for the credibility of NATO, and for the soul of the transatlantic relationship. If the US were to annex Greenland, it would be a game changer, not just for Denmark, but for all of Europe. But what exactly is at stake here? What will happen if Europe fails to stop this annexation? Let's dive deeper into the complexities and stakes of this looming crisis. The stakes have never been higher. For decades, Greenland, a territory of Denmark, has been a quiet but strategically vital part of the global chessboard. With its proximity to the Arctic, rich natural resources, and geopolitical significance, it has attracted the attention of superpowers, but it's never been a serious point of contention until now. Under Trump, however, the situation has shifted dramatically. What began as a casual suggestion to purchase Greenland has evolved into a clear, unequivocal desire to annex the island, a move that threatens to shake the very pillars of the NATO alliance. For Europe, this isn't just about economic or security interests, it's about something much more fundamental: sovereignty. A US takeover would violate Denmark's sovereignty and Greenland's right to self-determination. It would tear at the very fabric of international law and create a rift so deep that NATO itself might not survive. Can the alliance stand strong if the United States, the guarantor of its defense, undermines the very concept of sovereignty in favor of territorial expansion? This threat is existential. If Europe fails to confront it, the world could see a NATO without credibility, a Europe left vulnerable, and an Atlantic alliance in tatters. To understand why the US pursuit of Greenland is so alarming, we must look at the historical and geopolitical backdrop. Greenland's strategic value has long been recognized, but until recently, it was a quiet part of the global order tied to Denmark, a NATO ally, and governed by the agreement that allowed the US military to have a presence on the island under the radar, but always ready. The US has been using Greenland as a forward base for decades, an important part of its Arctic strategy and broader military defense posture. The 1951 agreement between Denmark, Greenland, and the United States set the stage for a strong military alliance, with the US able to build bases and deploy forces. But these agreements were based on cooperation, mutual benefit, and respect for sovereignty. Now the game has changed. Trump's threats mark a dangerous shift, from cooperation to coercion, from partnership to territorial claims. And this has sent shockwaves through Europe. For Europe, this isn't just a disagreement over military base access or trade agreements. It's about the erosion of long-standing international agreements, the disintegration of established norms of diplomacy, and the potential unraveling of global stability. A US annexation would not only threaten Greenland's sovereignty, but also throw Europe into an era of uncertainty and jeopardize the very system that has kept the world relatively peaceful for decades. The stage is set for a confrontation that could define the future of international diplomacy. But how will Europe respond? Just months ago, many in Europe dismissed Trump's Greenland ambitions as mere rhetoric, an eccentricity of a president whose attention flitted from one issue to the next. But then something changed. What once seemed like an idle threat began to take form. Trump's rhetoric grew more pointed, and soon the world realized that this wasn't just a passing whim. This was a serious political maneuver, and Europe was caught off guard. The turning point came when Trump pushed forward with proposals that seemed impossible to ignore: announcements of new military deployments, discussions of deals for Greenland's resources, and increased pressure on Denmark and Greenland to entertain the possibility of U.S. annexation. For European leaders, this was a wake-up call. Greenland, a peaceful, self-governing territory, suddenly became the focal point of an existential crisis that threatened to fracture the very alliances Europe had spent decades building. The initial response was predictably diplomatic. European leaders worked quickly to calm tensions, emphasizing their willingness to engage in talks and negotiate favorable economic deals for the U.S. Yet, beneath the surface, it was clear that no amount of trade deals or military compromises could defuse the core issue: Greenland's sovereignty. Now, Europe was faced with a grim reality. Trump wasn't just threatening to change the balance of power in the Arctic, he was willing to risk NATO's cohesion to achieve his goal. The question loomed large: could diplomacy still save the day, or had the damage already been done? Behind Trump's persistent threats to annex Greenland lies a complex web of strategic, economic, and political motives. On the surface, it may seem like a purely territorial grab, but the underlying mechanisms are far more insidious. Trump isn't just after land, he's after control, leverage, and a reshaping of global power dynamics that suits his vision. At the core of this power play is the United States' desire for greater dominance in the Arctic. As the ice caps continue to melt and the region's resources become more accessible, control over Greenland becomes not just a military advantage but an economic one. Greenland holds vast untapped reserves of minerals and energy resources which could fuel America's energy independence in the coming decades. But there's more. Greenland is also a crucial strategic asset in the U.S. military's Arctic defense strategy. Its location provides a forward base from which the U.S. can project power into the Arctic and the North Atlantic areas, increasingly contested by both Russia and China. It's no coincidence that Trump's rhetoric about Greenland has escalated alongside growing tensions in these regions. However, the most dangerous aspect of this play is its broader implications for global governance. By seeking to annex Greenland, Trump is signaling a willingness to flout international norms and agreements in pursuit of unilateral advantage. This move could set a dangerous precedent, where geopolitical interests are decided by brute force, undermining the principles of sovereignty and self-determination that have shaped global diplomacy for centuries. Europe can no longer afford to treat this as a minor geopolitical squabble. The stakes are higher than ever before. The situation took a drastic turn when Trump's administration doubled down on its demands. No longer content with just negotiating military bases or economic deals, the U.S. began pushing aggressively for territorial control over Greenland. The idea of annexation was no longer a mere hypothetical. It was a real looming threat that Europe could no longer ignore. As tensions escalated, the U.S. administration launched a series of actions designed to test Europe's resolve. There were vague threats of tariffs, military posturing, and public statements designed to create division within Europe. The message was clear: either Europe cedes to American demands or faces the wrath of an unpredictable and powerful U.S. president. For Europe, this was the breaking point. The core of NATO, which had always stood as a beacon of unity and collective defense, was now at risk of unraveling. If the U.S. could simply annex a NATO member's territory, what was left of the alliance's credibility? How could Europe trust in a defense pact where the most powerful member was willing to trample on the sovereignty of its own allies? In the face of this crisis, European leaders had no choice but to escalate their response. They rallied around Denmark and Greenland, publicly rejecting any U.S. move to seize the island. Behind closed doors, European diplomats engaged with U.S. counterparts, demanding that the administration step back from this dangerous path. But the clock was ticking, and every passing day made it more difficult to avoid a confrontation. Europe stood at a crossroads: allow the U.S. to dictate terms, or stand firm in defense of international law, sovereignty, and the very principles that held NATO together. While the geopolitical ramifications of Trump's threats to annex Greenland are significant, it's the human cost that really hits home. For the people of Greenland, this issue is personal. They are caught in the middle of a high-stakes political game that threatens to strip them of their self-determination and sovereignty. Greenlanders have long enjoyed a certain level of autonomy with control over many aspects of their daily lives, from local governance to their cultural identity. The prospect of U.S. annexation strikes at the heart of their ability to decide their own future. To many, it's not just about land or resources, it's about their right to exist as a people with their own voice in the world. For Denmark, the situation is equally fraught. As a small nation, its sovereignty and international standing have always been intertwined with its role in NATO and its global partnerships. The thought of having one of its territories taken over by a foreign power, especially the United States, would be a direct challenge to Denmark's dignity and independence. The Danish people, many of whom have strong historical ties to Greenland, are watching closely, torn between the pressure of maintaining their alliance with the U.S. and the need to defend their national integrity. Europe, as a whole, is also feeling the emotional weight of this crisis. For generations, the continent has built its security around collective defense, the idea that an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all. Now, with the U.S. threatening to annex Greenland, the very foundations of this unity are being shaken. The people of Europe are asking themselves, how much longer can we trust the United States to be a partner when its actions seem more unpredictable and self-serving than ever? This is more than just a diplomatic challenge, it's a moral one. Europe must stand not only for its own interests, but also for the principles that have guided international relations for decades. The message to the people of Greenland and Denmark, as well as the broader European public, is clear: sovereignty and self-determination are not negotiable. Europe's defense of these ideals will define its future. The issue of Greenland's sovereignty is not just an internal matter for Europe or Denmark. It has far-reaching implications for global geopolitics. The Arctic region, once considered remote and sparsely inhabited, has now become a flashpoint for global powers. With melting ice and newfound access to resources, the race for control of the region has intensified, and Greenland's position has made it a strategic prize. If the United States were to annex Greenland, it would send shockwaves through the global order. The most immediate concern would be the destabilization of NATO. As the alliance's strongest member, the U.S. sets the tone for collective defense and cooperation. If the U.S. were to unilaterally annex a NATO member's territory, how could other nations trust that their sovereignty would be respected in the future? The credibility of NATO's defense commitments would be severely undermined, and the alliance itself could fracture. Beyond NATO, the geopolitical implications of a U.S. annexation of Greenland would be felt across the world. Russia, already a key player in the Arctic, would view such a move as a direct challenge to its own interests in the region. The delicate balance of power between Russia, the U.S., and China would be further disrupted, with each nation vying for influence over the Arctic's resources and strategic routes. A destabilized Arctic could trigger a new Cold War where global powers compete for control of an increasingly vital region. The ripple effects would extend even further. Countries in the global south, particularly those that rely on international law and norms to safeguard their sovereignty, would watch with concern. If a powerful nation like the U.S. can simply take control of another's territory, what does this mean for smaller countries and their ability to protect their own borders and resources? The precedent set by such an action would challenge the very foundation of international law. Europe must now consider how to navigate this global crisis. Its response to Greenland will shape its standing on the world stage and determine whether it remains a credible power in an increasingly multipolar world. As Europe stands at this crossroads, the future is uncertain. The question isn't whether the U.S. will pursue its interests in Greenland, it's how the situation will unfold. Europe must prepare for three possible futures, each with its own implications for the continent, NATO, and global stability. Scenario 1. The best case. A diplomatic resolution. In the best case scenario, Europe's firm stance against U.S. annexation forces the Trump administration to back down. Through intense diplomatic pressure, Europe and the U.S. negotiate a new agreement that respects Denmark's sovereignty and Greenland's right to self-determination. NATO emerges from the crisis stronger, with its unity reaffirmed by the successful defense of European values. In this scenario, the U.S. might even recognize the strategic value of working with Europe on Arctic security and resource management. A cooperative framework could be established, one that allows for military collaboration and economic partnership without infringing on Greenland's autonomy. Scenario 2. The middle ground. A fragile compromise. A more likely scenario is that Europe and the U.S. reach a fragile compromise where Greenland's sovereignty remains intact, but the U.S. gains more control over the island's military presence and access to its resources. This could involve an expanded NATO mission in the Arctic with a greater U.S. presence, but within the bounds of international law and agreements. However, this compromise would not come without costs. NATO's credibility would remain dented, and the transatlantic relationship would be forever altered. Trust would be fractured, and Europe would have to navigate a new, less predictable dynamic with the U.S. Scenario 3. The worst case. A shattered NATO and global instability. The worst-case scenario is that the U.S. goes ahead with annexing Greenland, disregarding Denmark's sovereignty and international law. This would not only destroy the NATO alliance, but also set a dangerous precedent for global geopolitics. Europe would find itself isolated, both politically and militarily, with no clear ally to turn to. The world would be plunged into a new era of global instability, where the U.S. could claim any territory it desires, and international norms would no longer hold sway. The repercussions for global security would be disastrous, leading to an arms race in the Arctic and potentially wider conflicts as other powers, particularly Russia and China, assert their influence in the region. The situation in Greenland is more than just a political dispute. It's a battle for the future of international law, sovereignty, and the very fabric of global alliances. Europe finds itself at a crossroads, forced to confront an unprecedented challenge to its security and values. The question isn't just about Greenland, it's about the future of NATO, the credibility of transatlantic relations, and the very principles that have underpinned global diplomacy for decades. If Europe fails to act decisively, the consequences could be catastrophic. The annexation of Greenland by the U.S. would not only shatter NATO, but would also send a message that sovereignty can be disregarded in favor of power and territorial ambition. It would mark the end of an era in international relations where agreements and norms were respected, and the beginning of a new age where might makes right. But Europe still has time to act. The message must be clear: Greenland's sovereignty is non-negotiable. The values of self-determination, international law, and respect for borders must be upheld. Europe's leaders must unite in defense of these principles and send a strong message to the U.S. that any attempt to annex Greenland will be met with firm resistance. This is a moment of profound importance. The future of Europe, NATO, and the international order depends on how Europe responds to this threat. It's time to stand firm, to defend what is right, and to ensure that the world doesn't slip into an era of geopolitical chaos.